This story is titled, I Caught My Wife in Bed with Another Man, So I Found My Perfect Revenge, Sold My Business Shares to My Best Friend for Pennies, Threw Out Her Belongings, and Filed for Divorce when she demanded half of everything with her lawyer. They discovered zero balance and she started begging for anything. Hey Reddit, my name is Marcus, and I'm 34 years old. Last week I was supposed to be at a conference in Miami, but it got canceled at the last minute. Instead of staying in the hotel or finding something else to do, I decided to come home early on Tuesday afternoon. I thought it would be nice to surprise Diana, my wife of 8 years, with an unexpected early return. I walked into our house expecting just another normal day. Maybe Diana would be working on her podcast or handling some marketing projects. What I didn't expect was to hear weird moaning sounds echoing through the hallway. And these weren't quiet, discreet sounds either. This was full volume, don't give a damn moaning that made it clear someone wasn't worried about being overheard. I followed the sound down our hallway, my confusion quickly turning to a sinking realization of what I was about to discover. The noise was coming from the spare room we'd converted into a recording studio for Diana's podcast. I'd spent weeks helping her set it up with proper soundproofing and equipment, thinking I was supporting her dreams. The door was cracked open slightly, and when I peered inside, I saw Diana with her back pressed against the wall. Some young guy was wrapped around her, and he looked like he was fresh out of college, probably around 24 years old and still wearing one of those stupid hipster beanies. I recognized him immediately as the sound technician she'd mentioned hiring for her podcast. What really struck me, oddly enough, was that they were going at it against the bare drywall wall, not even using the nice foam panel area I'd carefully installed. That detail stuck with me for some reason, like they couldn't even be bothered to use the good part of the room I'd worked so hard to create. The guy saw me first and his face went completely white as he scrambled to pull up his pants. "What the hell?" I said, standing in the doorway with what I'm sure was a look of complete disbelief. Diana's head whipped around toward me, and instead of looking ashamed or embarrassed like you'd expect, she actually looked annoyed. She casually adjusted her clothes like she was just finishing up a workout. "Christ, Marcus," she said with obvious irritation. "I thought you were in Miami until Thursday." "Yeah, clearly," I replied, my voice turning ice cold. "That's exactly why you brought him to our house." The tech guy tried squeezing past me in the doorway, mumbling something like, "Sorry, man," while refusing to make any eye contact. "Might want to zip up your pants all the way, buddy," I told him as he bolted down the hallway toward the front door. Diana just crossed her arms and looked at me with that familiar expression of mild inconvenience. "Great," she said. "Now I need to find a new sound editor." That's when I completely lost it. 8 years of marriage, and that was her response to being caught cheating? She was worried about finding a new sound editor? "Are you kidding me right now?" I shouted, slamming my hand against the doorframe so hard that it stung. "I catch you screwing some hipster in our house and you're worried about your podcast?" Diana actually took a step back, genuinely surprised by my outburst. In all our years together, I had never yelled at her. Ever. I was always the calm, reasonable one who talked things through rationally. "Lower your voice," she said, suddenly becoming defensive. "The neighbors will hear you." "Oh, now you're worried about noise," I shot back. "Because you two weren't exactly keeping it down a minute ago. It just happened, okay?" "It's not that big of a deal," Diana said, as if she was explaining away a minor inconvenience. "We've been having problems for months anyway. Don't act like you're surprised by this." When she mentioned problems, I knew what she meant. Over the past several months, she'd been increasingly distant and irritable with me. I'd been working longer hours trying to land new clients for my consulting business, and we'd fallen into that familiar pattern where we were like roommates more than spouses. I thought it was just typical marriage rough patch stuff, the kind of thing that happens when life gets busy and you stop making time for each other. I never imagined it was the kind of rough patch where she'd be sleeping with the sound guy in our home studio. I took a deep breath, feeling the momentary rage start to subside into something much colder and more calculated. "You know what? You're absolutely right," I said, my voice returning to its normal tone. "This really isn't that big of a deal." Without another word, I turned around and walked out of the room. I grabbed my laptop bag from the kitchen counter, got in my car, and drove straight across town to my brother Kevin's place. When I knocked on his door, he took one look at my face and handed me his spare key without asking a single question. That's the kind of brother Kevin has always been. He just knows when something serious has happened. That evening, we were sitting on his balcony with a couple of beers when I finally told him what had happened. "Holy shit," Kevin said, shaking his head in disbelief. "And she wasn't even sorry? She acted like you were interrupting a business meeting?" "Pretty much," I replied. "Like I should apologize for catching her." Kevin let out a snort of disgust. Classic Diana. You know, this reminds me of when she showed up 4 hours late to my wedding rehearsal because she was networking at some industry event. Then she had the nerve to get mad when Mom said something about it. I hadn't thought about that incident in years, but Kevin was right. Or the time she completely forgot about my company launch party because something came up with a client. How she'd gradually stopped asking about my day around year 3 of our marriage, like my work and my life had become background noise to her more important pursuits. She also did that thing at Dad's funeral, Kevin added quietly. When she was on her phone during the service, then claimed it was an urgent client issue that couldn't wait. But then I saw her posting on Instagram later that same day. That's when the clarity hit me like a freight train. This wasn't really about love, and it wasn't even about betrayal in the traditional sense. This was about respect. Diana hadn't just cheated on me. She had dismissed me entirely as a person. She saw me as someone whose feelings and dignity didn't matter enough to even warrant basic consideration. I realized in that moment that I wasn't going to play the role of the devastated, desperate husband begging her to reconsider. I was going to make absolutely sure she regretted underestimating me. The next morning, I found myself sitting across from Ms. Sullivan in her office on the 15th floor of a downtown Tampa building. Rain was tapping against the windows as I laid out my plan with no small talk or pleasantries. I want to transfer my 65% stake in the consulting firm to Kevin, I said, sliding a folder across her desk. She raised an eyebrow and leaned back in her chair. For how much? $15. Mrs. Sullivan leaned back further, studying me with the analytical expression that had earned her a reputation as the lawyer executives called when things got messy. Marcus, you know exactly what I'm going to say about this. I do. Tell me anyway. She opened the folder and glanced at the draft documents I'd prepared. If you transfer this business now, right before filing for divorce, it's going to get challenged as fraudulent conveyance. No judge will ignore the timing of something like this. I'm counting on the challenge, I replied calmly. That definitely got her attention. She set down the papers and looked at me more intently. Explain. Diana won't go after the money directly at first, I said. She'll posture and try to negotiate, thinking she has leverage. But if she believes this firm is part of the prize she's entitled to, she'll dig in and demand half of it. This way, I'm forcing her to fight over something she has absolutely no legal claim to. Mrs. Sullivan tapped her pen against the desk, processing my strategy. She'll claim transmutation. She'll argue that the value was commingled during your marriage, that your work during the marriage grew the equity, making it marital property. Let her try, I said. That's a long paper trail to argue against, and all she'll prove is that I made something valuable through my own work. Not that she built it with me. She couldn't even tell you what my company actually does beyond something with logistics and computers. Sullivan studied me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she evaluated not just my legal strategy, but my mental state. You're not playing defense here, are you? No, I said firmly. I'm going to war. She sighed, then turned to her computer and began typing. Fine. We'll timestamp the agreement today, but delay the actual execution until 48 hours before we file the divorce papers. That gives us a small cushion of deniability regarding the timing. I'm planning to time everything down to the hour, I told her. Does Kevin know he's about to become the target of a legal battle? She asked without looking up from her screen. I smiled faintly. It was his idea. What I didn't tell Ms. Sullivan was that Kevin and I had already spent 4 hours the night before, mapping out every financial move I needed to make. My brother had majored in business economics before starting his web development agency, and he understood this kind of chess game better than I did. He knew that protecting assets in a divorce wasn't just about hiding money. It was about creating a legal framework that would force Diana's team to fight battles they couldn't win. A week later, I was standing in line at the bank, waiting to sign off on 2 separate transfers that I knew would make Diana's future legal team lose their minds. The first transfer was $42,000 from my personal business account into Kevin's web development agency LLC as an expansion investment. This account was mine alone. I'd opened it 3 years before I even met Diana, and it had never been touched by any marital funds. The second transfer was $31,000 to pay off business debts that I'd personally co-signed for a warehouse management system that had failed to deliver last year. I'd personally guaranteed the loan but kept it completely separate from the main company books. Paying it off now served 2 purposes. It eliminated a debt that could potentially be counted as a marital liability, and it reduced my visible net worth on paper. Mr. Harrison, the bank manager said, stepping out of her office, we flagged these transfers for review. Of course they had. Large, unusual transfers always triggered additional scrutiny. I spent over an hour in her office, methodically verifying everything: the source of the funds, my business relationship with Kevin, and the legitimacy of the debts I was paying off. I showed her the LLC operating agreement, Kevin's business expansion plan, and the original loan documents. Everything was dated, organized, and completely legitimate. She eventually nodded her approval. Everything looks clean. It's just unusual timing for such large movements. Sometimes timing is everything, I replied. By the time I walked out of the bank, the funds were already moving. Ms. Sullivan had signed off on every form and every document in the paper trail. We had investment agreements, debt satisfaction notices, bank confirmations, everything documented and everything completely legal. My next stop was setting up a new account at the credit union Kevin used for his business. I opened a basic checking account with a $1,400 deposit to cover rent, food, and gas. It was a clean start with no transfers from any shared accounts. Nothing Diana could flag as suspicious or trace back to marital assets. Then I logged into our old joint account, one we hadn't used together in over a year, but that Diana still occasionally checked whenever she was feeling financially responsible. The balance showed $127. I left exactly $15 in the account. That account had once held significant savings, but I'd stopped using it long ago after we'd quietly moved into separate financial orbits. Diana had her podcast income and part-time marketing gigs, while I had my consulting fees and business distributions. But this was still the account she mentioned whenever her parents asked about our finances, so I decided to give her a symbol, a number she couldn't possibly miss. A message she'd read exactly as I intended. You get back what you invested. That night, Ms. Sullivan called to confirm that all the transfers had cleared successfully, and that my investment in Kevin's LLC was properly documented. Airtight, she said with satisfaction in her voice. Pre-marriage funds, legitimate business purpose, full documentation trail. After a brief pause, she added, "This isn't just asset protection, is it?" "No," I replied. "It's a statement." What I didn't realize until 4 days later was that I'd made a stupid oversight that could have compromised everything. I'd forgotten to unlink our shared Amazon account when I started setting up deliveries to Kevin's place. When I finally noticed that Diana was still logged in as the primary user, I quickly created a new account, but not before she would have gotten notifications about my purchases, basic household items for my temporary living situation. It was exactly the kind of careless mistake that could have tipped her off to what was happening. I immediately went through and changed all my other passwords, but I kept wondering what else I might have missed. I'd spent so much time meticulously planning the big financial moves that I nearly screwed myself over with something as simple as a shared streaming account. I had to be more careful. Diana might play dumb about business matters, but she was smart enough to connect dots once she had a reason to start looking for patterns. Looking at my growing to-do list, I realized I needed to secure my entire digital life completely. I spent an entire evening changing every password I could think of, setting up two-factor authentication on all my important accounts, and creating a new email address specifically for business and legal correspondence. When you're preparing for a divorce like this, it's often the small details that can completely sink your strategy. I wasn't going to let a forgotten password or a linked account derail everything I'd worked to set up. Meanwhile, Diana was recording her podcast with her co-hosts Carly and Megan when the courier arrived. They were discussing relationship red flags of all things, with Diana offering advice about communication and partnership. The irony was rich, coming from someone I'd caught with her pants down just a week earlier. When the doorbell rang, I heard her tell the others to hold that thought as she went to answer the door. Through the security camera app on my phone, I watched her open the door and accept a thick blue envelope sealed with a private delivery service sticker. She looked confused at first, then mildly irritated as she signed for it. She brought the envelope back to her recording area, telling Carly and Megan that it was probably just some paperwork from Marcus's company. She tore it open casually, still half engaged in their conversation about toxic relationship patterns. By the time she reached the second page, her voice trailed off mid-sentence. "Diana?" Carly asked. "You okay over there?" Diana's face completely transformed, not with sadness or fear, but with pure, undiluted rage. "That calculating piece of—" she hissed, forgetting that her microphone was still hot and recording everything. "What is it?" Megan asked, clearly concerned. "Marcus is filing for divorce," Diana snapped, her voice getting louder. "And he's— Wait, what the hell?" She couldn't even finish her sentence as she continued reading through the documents. The recording ended abruptly. Within minutes, my phone was buzzing with 3 missed calls from Diana's number, which I'd already blocked. She called again from what must have been Carly's phone, also blocked. Her lawyer, Ms. Carter, called Ms. Sullivan 9 times that day. 9 emails, 5 voicemails, and even a text message marked urgent response needed. I didn't respond to any of it. I wasn't hiding, I was watching and waiting. Kevin and I were reviewing some web development specifications when the call logs started flooding in. He glanced at my constantly buzzing phone and started laughing. Looks like Diana got her paperwork right on schedule. How much do you want to bet she's already called her mom to say you blindsided her? No bet, I said. That was probably call number 2 right after her lawyer. Kevin shook his head with a mix of amusement and disgust. Remember when she told everyone at Christmas that your business was just getting by? That was the same year you doubled your revenue and were billing high 6 figures. Like you were some struggling startup instead of a successful company. She never could keep numbers straight, I replied, except when it came to counting her Instagram followers. I watched it all unfold from a distance, not with pleasure, but with a sense of certainty about what I was doing. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precision. For years, I'd been predictable, calculated, and steady in our relationship. Diana had grown to assume that I'd always react the same way to any crisis, that I'd break down, beg her to reconsider, and offer to forgive anything just to keep our marriage together. She never expected this version of me. That courier wasn't just delivering legal paperwork. He was dropping the first domino in a carefully planned sequence. And I'd made sure Diana felt the full impact before she even understood what game we were now playing. At 2:47 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "You coward," Diana slurred into the phone, clearly having had quite a bit to drink. "You couldn't even talk to me first. Just papers and lawyers." "Like you talked to me before sleeping with your sound guy?" I replied, instantly regretting that I'd engaged with her at all. "That was different," she spat back. "At least I didn't try to hide money and steal everything we built together." "I'm not doing this, Diana. Talk to your lawyer." "Oh, I will," she said, her voice suddenly turning cold and threatening. "And when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never played these games. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what's coming for you." She hung up abruptly, leaving me sitting there in Kevin's dark guest room, wondering if I'd just made a tactical error by answering the phone. A voicemail would have been better evidence for my file. I immediately recorded the call information and exact timestamp in the document I was keeping, a running log of all our interactions. I'd read enough divorce horror stories to know that documentation is absolutely everything. The next morning, I woke up to 3 text messages from Diana, all sent at 4:12 a.m. "You think you're so clever with your little business tricks? My lawyer says what you did is illegal. Hope it was worth throwing away 8 years. I screenshot everything but didn't respond. It was just more evidence for the file. It didn't take long for the legal counterattack to begin. Within a week, Ms. Carter had filed 3 separate motions. The first challenged my transfer of the firm shares as fraudulent conveyance. The second demanded an injunction on my LLC investment with Kevin. The third attempted to freeze all remaining assets under my name pending court review. But the legal front was just the beginning. The personal attack started next. First came the texts from our mutual friends. "Diana said you emptied all the accounts and left her with nothing. Is that true? Hey, heard things got really ugly with you guys. Diana's really upset about how this all went down. Why did you just spring divorce papers on her without talking first?" I responded to each one with simple, factual statements. Diana cheated. I filed for divorce. All my financial moves were legitimate and documented. I didn't elaborate or try to defend myself beyond those basic facts. Then came the call from my mother, and I knew I was in trouble the moment she started talking. "Marcus Daniel Harrison," she began, "and it's never a good sign when your mother uses your full name. Did you really empty all your accounts before filing for divorce?" "Mom, it's not—" Diana's mother called me in tears, she interrupted. "She said you're financially abusing her daughter and that you've been planning this for months." I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling a headache coming on. "Mother, Diana was cheating on me in our house." There was a pause before she responded. "Well, that doesn't mean you can just take all the money and leave her with nothing. I didn't take—" I stopped myself, realizing this conversation wasn't going to go anywhere productive. "Can we talk about this later? I'm meeting with my lawyer in 25 minutes. Just tell me you're not being vindictive," she said, her voice softening slightly. "That's not how your father and I raised you." I wanted to explain about premarital assets and legitimate business transactions, but I knew it would fall on deaf ears. My mother had always loved Diana like the daughter she never had. When we first got married, I thought it was wonderful that they were so close. Now it felt like another front in this war. "I'm handling everything legally and fairly," I said finally. "That's all I can say right now." She sighed heavily. "Well, Karen says Diana is completely devastated by all this." Of course Karen, Diana's mother, would say that. She'd never heard a version of events where her daughter wasn't the victim. My mother had always seen Diana as the daughter she never had. And when we first got married, I thought their close relationship was a blessing. Now it felt like Diana knew exactly what she was doing by getting our mothers involved in this mess. Ms. Sullivan called me when the court documents hit her desk later that week. "She wants everything," she said, tapping a pile of papers. "They're claiming the share sale was a sham transaction designed to defraud the marital estate." I set my coffee down, completely unfazed by this development. "Let them try." "Marcus," Sullivan said, tilting her head and studying my expression. "They've also asked for an emergency hearing. They want a judge to void the share transfer immediately and issue retroactive financial controls. They think it'll scare me into backing down." She nodded slowly. "Will it?" "No, we'll meet them in court." 4 days later, we found ourselves in a standard family law courtroom with uncomfortable benches and harsh fluorescent lighting. Diana sat at the petitioner's table next to Ms. Carter, wearing an outfit that screamed, "responsible adult." A subtle makeup look and sensible blazer, with an expression of wounded dignity carefully crafted for the judge's benefit. She glanced at me once during the proceedings, her eyes narrowing slightly before she looked away. Ms. Carter stood up and began her performance. She talked passionately about betrayal, deception, and financial manipulation. She held up the investment agreement like it was evidence in a murder trial, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. "Who moves $73,000 just days before filing for divorce?" she asked, looking directly toward the judge with an expression of moral outrage. When Carter finished her dramatic presentation, Ms. Sullivan stood up calmly. She had no notes in her hands and made no dramatic gestures. She simply pointed out, in a measured tone, that my consulting firm was inherited property that I'd received prior to our marriage. She explained that its growth had been consistent and well documented, managed almost exclusively through premarital business structures. "Inheritances are separate property under Florida law, Your Honor," she said plainly, "even if my colleague's client finds the timing distasteful." As for the investment in Kevin's LLC, Sullivan placed certified documents, business plans, and pre-marriage account ledgers neatly before the court clerk. Every dollar came from an account that was opened 3 years before Mr. Harrison and Miss Cooper were married. The funds were never commingled with marital assets. The investment has a clear business purpose and full documentation. The judge flipped through the documents slowly while Ms. Carter fumed and Diana sat with perfect posture, her jaw visibly tight with controlled anger. Then came the ruling, preliminary, but enough to draw a clear line in the sand. The court denied the request to void the firm transfer. The court also denied the motion to reverse the LLC investment. Diana was awarded a modest temporary support amount, but her request for legal fees was rejected outright. The judge noted quite directly that Diana had her own income from podcast work and marketing projects. Diana stood up abruptly when she heard the ruling. "This is..." The judge looked up, his eyebrows raised in warning. "Excuse me, Miss Cooper? He planned this for months. He's hiding money," she blurted out, her composure finally cracking. The judge sighed and removed his glasses, looking tired but firm. "Ms. Cooper, please sit down or I'll hold you in contempt of court." "But he..." "Sit down." The judge's voice was tired but absolutely firm. "This court operates on evidence, not accusations." Diana slowly sank back into her chair, her face flushed with embarrassment and barely contained rage. The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "As I was saying," the judge continued, putting his glasses back on, "the emergency motions are denied. We'll revisit these matters during regular discovery." He glanced between Diana and me with a look that suggested he'd seen this type of drama many times before. I strongly suggest that both parties remember that emotional outbursts do not help your respective cases. Outside the courthouse, Ms. Sullivan adjusted her glasses and exhaled slowly. "That could have gone much worse," she muttered under her breath. "Judge Wilson doesn't usually let outbursts like that slide without consequences." "He felt sorry for her," I said, watching Diana and her lawyer through the courthouse windows as they had what appeared to be a heated discussion. That evening, Kevin texted me a screenshot from Carly's Instagram story. It showed Diana, Carly, and Megan at some trendy bar with a caption that read, "Supporting our girl through the storm. Men are trash." Kevin had added his own commentary. "Classy. She cheats, you file for divorce, and somehow you're the trash." Of course, that would be their takeaway from all this. I was eating takeout Chinese food and reviewing client projections when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Diana's sound guy, the one I'd caught her with in our studio. "Hey man, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't know she was married at first." Yeah, sure he didn't. I didn't bother responding to him, just took another screenshot from my ever-growing file of documentation. The social media campaign started in earnest the next day. Not from Diana directly, she was too careful and calculating for that, but from Megan, who was by far the most vocal of her podcast co-hosts. She posted a long, angry rant about men who use financial warfare during divorce proceedings and how the legal system unfairly favors calculating husbands who plan ahead. She never used my name directly, but she included enough specific details that anyone who knew us would immediately recognize the situation she was describing. She ended her post with a call for her followers to support women dealing with financial manipulation by subscribing to their podcast and sharing their stories. That afternoon, I received an email from one of my clients asking if everything was okay with my business. He'd seen some concerning posts from people connected to my wife and wanted to make sure there were no issues that might affect our working relationship. 3 more similar messages followed from other clients throughout the week. I drafted a simple, professional email to my entire client list explaining that I was going through a divorce, that some unfortunate social media posts might be circulating from people in my personal life, and that my business operations remained completely unaffected by my personal situation. I thanked them for their understanding and discretion, and most responded with supportive messages. 2 days later, Kevin called me with an update that was both amusing and concerning. "Dude, Diana's friend just tried connecting with me on LinkedIn. Megan or Carly?" "Megan?" And then she immediately sent me a message asking if I'd pressured you into hiding assets through my company. I laughed despite myself. "What did you say?" "Nothing yet, but I saved a screenshot of everything." "Forward it to Sullivan. That's harassment, and it's exactly the kind of overreach we've been waiting for." That evening, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. "You think you're so smart with your little financial games. Everyone's going to know what kind of man you really are." I didn't respond, just documented it and sent it to Ms. Sullivan. The next day, she filed for a restraining order against Megan for harassment and added it to our counterclaims against Diana for orchestrating a campaign of defamation. The judge granted the restraining order immediately. Megan couldn't contact me, my brother, or any of my business associates. She couldn't post about me on social media, and she couldn't come within 150 feet of my home or office. Diana's lawyer tried to argue that Diana had nothing to do with Megan's actions, but the judge wasn't convinced. This was especially true after Ms. Sullivan presented text messages from Diana to Megan discussing various ways to pressure Marcus that we'd obtained through the discovery process. The next podcast episode was notably subdued compared to their usual energetic format. Diana mentioned being unable to discuss certain personal matters due to ongoing legal situations, and you could hear the frustration in her voice even through her attempt to sound professional. I thought things might settle into a predictable legal rhythm after that, with both sides exchanging paperwork and preparing for the eventual settlement negotiations. I was completely wrong. The next morning, I walked out to the parking lot of Kevin's building to get my car and immediately noticed something was very wrong. There was a long, deep scratch running down the entire driver's side, gouged all the way through the paint down to the bare metal. It ran from the headlight all the way to the taillight in one continuous line, clearly deliberate and obviously malicious. The security cameras in the parking lot had mysteriously malfunctioned overnight, according to the building management. No footage was available from the time period when the damage occurred. I couldn't prove that Diana had done it, but the timing wasn't exactly subtle. The damage estimate came to $3,800, which meant I was stuck paying the insurance deductible and dealing with the hassle of repairs. I filed a police report, but I knew nothing would come of it without evidence or witnesses. Ms. Sullivan advised against directly accusing Diana without proof, saying it would make me look vindictive and potentially hurt our case. So I paid the deductible, got my car fixed, and kept my mouth shut about my suspicions. Silently, I added this incident to the growing mental tally I was keeping. They wanted me rattled, cornered, and exhausted by the constant pressure. Instead, it only steeled my resolve. Every attack, every manipulation, every attempt to make me lose my composure only confirmed what I'd already suspected about Diana's character. They didn't care about truth or fairness. They cared about controlling the narrative and making me look like the villain. Too bad for them that I'd stopped caring about stories and narratives a long time ago. I cared about facts, documentation, and legal strategy. 3 days later, Diana tried a completely different angle. She showed up at my office unannounced, asking my assistant if she could just talk to Marcus for 5 or 6 minutes. She put on her most reasonable, conciliatory voice and claimed she just wanted to work things out like adults. Fortunately, my assistant had been thoroughly briefed about the situation. She politely but firmly told Diana that I was unavailable and that she should contact my lawyer if she needed to communicate with me about anything. Diana left behind a handwritten note claiming she was just trying to find a way to work things out directly between us because she was tired of paying lawyers and wanted to avoid more conflict. As if this was really about saving money on legal fees, rather than her growing realization that she was losing this battle on every front. I immediately gave the note to Ms. Sullivan, who added it to our growing file documenting Diana's attempts to circumvent proper legal channels. If Diana genuinely wanted to have a conversation about resolving our issues, she could schedule mediation through our respective lawyers like any other divorcing couple. But she didn't want mediation or professional guidance. She wanted to catch me off guard and manipulate me into making concessions outside of the legal framework we'd established. A week after that incident, Diana's mother called my mother 4 separate times, crying about how I was supposedly destroying her daughter's life and future. My mother, to her credit, had finally started seeing through this emotional manipulation. I told Karen that if Diana hadn't cheated on you, none of this would be happening, my mother said when she called to update me. She got so angry that she hung up on me. Ms. Sullivan continued to advise me to stay completely silent on social media. No posts, no comments, nothing that could be taken out of context or twisted to make me look bad. I followed her advice religiously, but it was strange watching Diana's carefully curated narrative spread completely unchallenged across her social media platforms. She posted vague but emotionally charged updates about starting over and healing from toxic situations. She shared inspirational quotes about strength and resilience, along with plenty of supportive comments from her podcast audience who had only heard her version of events. Meanwhile, our lawyers continued exchanging mountains of paperwork, financial disclosures, interrogatories, requests for document production. It was the mundane but essential machinery of divorce grinding forward methodically, while the emotional theater played out for public consumption. Discovery, however, proved to be Diana's complete undoing. It started with what seemed like a standard income affidavit from her legal team, showing modest podcast revenue, a few marketing contracts, and minimal savings. At first glance, it looked reasonable and consistent with what I knew about her financial situation. Ms. Sullivan raised an eyebrow while reading through the numbers. "She's claiming just under $26,000 in liquid assets," she said, scrolling through the financial disclosure. "Claims that most of her income goes directly to business expenses and her investments in growing the podcast." "She's lying," I said without hesitation. Last year alone, she took 4 separate business trips to Orlando for podcasting conferences. She bought a MacBook Pro for podcast editing that she doesn't even do herself. She hires people for that. And she leases a BMW that costs more than our monthly mortgage payment. Sullivan gave a short, knowing nod. "Then let's dig deeper and see what we can find." Our forensic accountant was thorough and methodical. He traced everything: Venmo transaction histories, PayPal accounts, even the content creation LLC that Diana had formed without ever telling me about it. We found unreported income from sponsored content deals, speaking engagements that had been billed through Carly's husband's consulting company, and a side gig doing social media consulting for a women's lifestyle brand. Then we found the secret bank account. There was $51,000 sitting in a separate account that Diana had opened using her maiden name and her parents' address. Money had been steadily transferred into this account from our joint accounts over the course of 4 years, always in small increments that wouldn't trigger any automatic alerts or suspicion. What really sealed her fate was when our accountant discovered that I'd carelessly left myself logged into our shared laptop. Another oversight on my part that actually worked in my favor. Diana had used that laptop to access our joint investment account after I'd moved out, transferring another $14,000 to her hidden account. The digital trail was unmistakable and completely undermined her claims of financial victimhood. Ms. Sullivan laid out everything in court with methodical precision, line by line, date by date, transaction by transaction. Diana's lawyer tried desperately to argue that the hidden money was just emergency savings, claiming that Diana had felt unsafe discussing financial planning with me during our marriage. The judge didn't buy that explanation for even a second. He didn't raise his voice or deliver a dramatic lecture. He simply leaned forward and said in a measured tone, "Miss Cooper, removing marital funds secretly over the course of several years doesn't constitute emergency planning. It constitutes dissipation of marital assets." Diana's face flushed bright red, and she stared straight ahead like she couldn't hear what was being said about her. The judge granted Sullivan's motion to include the hidden $51,000 in the marital estate calculation. He ruled that Diana had to return half of that money to the estate immediately, and he ordered her to pay $9,500 in legal fees for what he called deliberate obfuscation requiring unnecessary investigation. In legal terms, this was the clear turning point in our case. In personal terms, I could see it in Diana's entire demeanor. A subtle but unmistakable shift from righteous indignation to defensive damage control. That night, Kevin came over to my apartment with Chinese takeout to celebrate what felt like our first real victory. "I heard about the hidden account," he said while unpacking the containers. "You know, this reminds me of when she forgot to tell you about that promotion at her marketing job because she wanted to surprise you with a trip. Then she never actually booked the trip, but still expected credit for the thoughtful gesture." I laughed, adding, "And somehow I was supposed to be grateful for her good intentions." Kevin shook his head in disbelief. "You know what I honestly don't get? She had a decent guy who supported her podcast dream, even though it wasn't making any real money. A guy who helped set up her entire recording space and literally never complained when she'd cancel plans for emergency podcast episodes. And she throws all of that away for some random dude in a beanie. Her loss," I said, and I was surprised to realize that I genuinely meant it. "Damn right it's her loss," Kevin said, raising his beer glass in a mock toast. To Diana finally getting screwed over for once. 7 months after I'd walked in on Diana and the beanie guy, we stood in court for the final hearing. The air felt thick with finality, not drama or emotion, just the weight of a conclusion that had been inevitable for months. Ms. Carter still represented Diana, but her arguments had shifted dramatically from our early court appearances. She was no longer trying to destroy me or claiming I'd stolen everything. Instead, she was focused on trying to secure better alimony terms and salvaging whatever she could from the wreckage of Diana's legal strategy. Judge Wilson had reviewed everything thoroughly. Financial disclosures, business valuations, asset lists, the whole paper trail we'd built over months of discovery. There were no dramatic speeches or theatrical moments, just facts and figures laid out systematically. He ruled that my transfer of the business to Kevin would stand. The business was inherited and maintained as separate property and transferred with proper documentation, he said. The court finds insufficient evidence to void the transaction. But then he paused and looked directly at me. However, the court does recognize a marital interest in the growth of the business during the marriage and imputes a value of $85,000 as Ms. Cooper's equitable share of that growth. Ms. Sullivan didn't react visibly. We'd anticipated this kind of compromise. What mattered most was that the transfer itself remained valid, and Diana couldn't get her hands on the actual business. My investment in Kevin's LLC was also upheld. The judge acknowledged that the timing had been strategically advantageous to me, but he found that it served a legitimate business purpose and had been properly documented from start to finish. Diana sat completely motionless throughout the ruling, her eyes fixed on some middle distance like she was trying to mentally escape from the courtroom. Then came the final settlement numbers. Ms. Carter had initially demanded $7,200 in monthly spousal support for 6 years, which would have totaled over $500,000. Now, Diana was walking away with $38,000 total, paid out in installments over 20 months. The judge noted Diana's demonstrated earning capacity from her various income streams and her failure to disclose assets as significant factors in the modest award he was granting. When the judge asked if both parties accepted the terms, Diana finally spoke for the first time during the entire hearing. "Do I have a choice?" Her voice was flat and completely resigned. "You can appeal, Miss Cooper," the judge replied evenly, "but based on the evidence presented today, I would not advise it." She nodded once, barely perceptibly. "Then I accept the terms." As we stood to leave the courtroom, Diana's purse slipped from her hands and spilled its contents across the floor. As she knelt down to gather her things, she looked up at me with eyes that were brimming with unexpected tears. "I hope it was worth it," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "Yes, it was," I said without hesitation. She looked away immediately, quickly stuffing her belongings back into her purse. We never spoke directly to each other again after that moment. Outside the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of lightness. Not victory or vindication, but something quieter and more profound. It was resolution. Ms. Sullivan shook my hand firmly. "It's done," she said with professional satisfaction. "The paperwork should be finalized within 12 days. "Thank you," I said, and I genuinely meant it. She'd been worth every penny of her fees. The aftermath of the divorce unfolded in ways that were both predictable and messy. Diana's podcast lost its main sponsorship deal after a recording of her courtroom meltdown somehow leaked online and started circulating on social media. The clip of her shouting, "He planned this for months, he's hiding money," became a minor internet meme for a few weeks, which couldn't have been good for her professional reputation. Meghan was eventually ordered to pay a substantial fine for violating the restraining order. Apparently, she couldn't resist making a few more pointed social media posts about financial abusers that were clearly directed at me. Carly, to her credit, eventually distanced herself from both Diana and Meghan and actually reached out to apologize for getting involved in something that wasn't her business. Diana didn't move back to Michigan like she'd threatened to do during our worst arguments. Instead, she stayed in Tampa and found work with a mid-sized marketing firm. She occasionally posts cryptic social media updates about healing, personal growth, and moving forward with her life. Her podcast limped along as a solo venture for a while, but with drastically reduced listenership compared to when she had co-hosts and regular sponsors. One unexpected casualty of the divorce was my friendship with Dave, my former college roommate. He tried to stay neutral at first, which I actually respected, but he eventually stopped returning my phone calls altogether. Last I heard through mutual acquaintances, he and his wife still meet Diana for brunch every month. Some friendships simply can't survive the gravitational pull of divorce, no matter how hard you try to keep them intact. What surprised me most about the entire experience wasn't how the legal system worked, or even Diana's reaction to losing. It was how quickly the narrative shifted once money and documented facts became involved. Our mutual friends had initially sided with Diana almost automatically. She was the wounded wife whose cold, calculating husband had ambushed her with divorce papers and financial manipulation. But when the financial facts came out during court proceedings, when her hidden accounts and secret spending became part of the public record, those same friends got suspiciously quiet about the whole situation. Suddenly, nobody wanted to talk about what a victim Diana was or how unfairly I treated her. Kevin's web development agency launched its logistics management platform 8 months after the divorce was finalized. We landed 3 major shipping companies as clients within the first few weeks of going live. The $42,000 investment I'd made returned itself fourfold in the first year of operation, making it one of the smartest business decisions I'd ever made. My consulting business went through a rebranding process, and we now focus specifically on supply chain resilience for mid-sized companies. We're smaller than we used to be, but significantly more profitable. I'm working with clients who truly value expertise over volume, which makes every project more rewarding. I bought a townhouse closer to downtown Tampa. Nothing flashy or ostentatious, but it's completely mine. There's no podcast equipment cluttering up the spare rooms, no constant drama and emotional outbursts, and no walking on eggshells around someone's unpredictable moods. It's just a peaceful space where I can actually breathe and think clearly. People talk about winning in divorce like it's primarily about money or property division. But my real victory wasn't in keeping my business or exposing Diana's hidden accounts, though those things certainly mattered. It was in refusing to play the role she'd cast for me, the devastated, desperate husband who would be willing to overlook anything just to keep her in his life. And that symbolic $15 I left in our joint account, that was worth every penny for the message it sent. You get back exactly what you put into a relationship, and Diana had stopped investing in ours long before I caught her with the sound guy. Looking back on everything, I realized that the signs had always been there, hiding in plain sight. The networking events that mysteriously ran late into the night. Her sudden intense interest in upgrading podcast equipment whenever a new tech guy came around to help. The way she'd consistently criticize my supposed lack of ambition, despite the fact that my business was financially supporting both of us while she chased her creative dreams. But that's all right. Better late than never to finally see someone's true character. Some guys get completely destroyed in divorce proceedings because they can't separate emotion from strategy. They're so busy feeling betrayed or angry or heartbroken that they make stupid, impulsive decisions that end up costing them everything they've worked for. I decided early on that I wouldn't be one of those guys. So if you're facing something similar in your own life, remember this. It's not about revenge or getting even. It's about refusing to be a victim of someone else's choices. It's about taking control of the things you can actually control and letting go of everything else that's outside your influence. As for Diana, The last I heard through the grapevine, she's dating some marketing executive who's 12 years older than her and apparently has quite a bit of money. Good luck to him. I genuinely hope he enjoys the experience of being with her more than I did.